Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadi, your instructor for this INR 2002 course. And as you know, today I'm going to focus on chapter 30. We are talking right now about the last couple of chapters we are focusing on for this particular course. Okay, having said that one, as you know, chapter 30's topic is about peacekeeping, and peace building. Very, very important topics as far as, international relation is concerned. By reading this chapter, you would see basically one of the major tasks of international community. You remember when we were talking about United Nations, and I mentioned that United Nations, your text is talking about all those, different list of, goals of the United Nations. And I said, remember the three P's: peace and, security, prosperity, which is another word for economic, development, and last but not least, promotion of human rights. Is that right? So remember those three goals. So now we are back and focusing on the notion of peace and peace and security. And one tool for that one, obviously, with the service that international organization like the UN has been providing, is by having a force to separate the warring faction. So you want to make sure that there is a group of people somewhere in the middle, is that right, to keep them apart and provide opportunity for the two sides to become a little bit more level-headed and hopefully what? Hopefully start negotiating. Because as you know, when there is a dispute, if the diplomats are not negotiating and trying to manage the crisis in a civilized fashion, then it becomes the opportunity for the generals, and there's nothing wrong with generals, is that right? But opportunity for generals and soldiers to basically get at it. And usually when that happens, a lot of people, they get, lose their life, or, it impacts their life, and especially the life of the civilians. And that's what I be, as a pacifist, that's one of the things I would be very concerned about. Okay, after reading chapter 30, one of the things that you should be able to do is you should focus on some of these topics, like what? Like UN and collective security, like peacekeeping in the Cold War period, all the way from 1945 to 1989, then peacekeeping in the post-Cold War period from 1989 to the present, and also peace building, operations, and of course then there's going to be a notion of what do we learn from all that conclusion. So in this chapter, you gain some understanding of what's the meaning of peace, keeping and peace building. What's the difference? The evolution of the UN peacekeeping and peace building, activities. And you would also learn something about the challenges. So having said that, now let's start with, slide number 4. Is that right? Because the other ones were 1, 2, and 3. Here we go. Slide number 4, and focuses on what the United Nations and collective security. Again, I'd like to remind you that if you remember, the United Nations has 3 major goals. Okay, the 3 P's. I keep emphasizing that 3 P's: peace and security. We call it prosperity, but it's actually economic development. I chose prosperity as a word that used to be used by what? Thomas Jefferson. Way before he knew about something is going to be developed in future, we're going to call it, United, Nation. Prosperity, a word, interchangeably used with economic development. The nice thing about it, it also starts with a P. And the last but not least, promotion of human rights. Okay, so in that regard, we can say since 1945, the United Nations was established based on the notion of collective security. What does collective security mean? That means it's a community of nations, is that right? And, theoretically, they start allying with one another in such a way that if any of them, is that right? Tries to be aggressive toward one of the other members, all the other members are supposed to be what? Supporting the victim against the aggressor. That's the theory of it. Now, how many times this has happened? Is that theoretically possible? It works apparently in theory, but in practice, as you can see from what the chapter has been talking about, it has not necessarily always happened that same way. And in fact, we can say that very frankly, during the Cold War period, collective security really didn't work. It has worked really twice. One time it happened during the Korean War, and I tell you a little bit about that story. And what happened was, as you know, collective security happens when the Security Council makes a decision, because Security Council is the organ of the UN that focuses on the peace and security issues. Okay, so what happened was there was a major disagreement between U.S. from one side and U.S. and U.K. and France, and at that time, in fact, it was not People's Republic of China, which is right now taking that seat. And that time it was the island of we used to call it Nationalist China. Is that right? The island that now we call Taiwan. So out of the 5 permanent members, only one of them, Russia, or better to say at that time, Soviet Union, had a reservation. What do you mean by there's a conflict? What do you mean by North Korea has, attacked South Korea? North Korea is trying to unify its, you see what I mean? So it was a different definition. But the other 4 permanent members, they said, no, it's very clear that North Korea as a communist wants to take over the South, so we make this one to be a big issue. So because Soviet Union in the Security Council felt itself to be, oh my gosh, everybody's against me and this and that. They thought they were making the right decision. They quit the room. They quit the meeting. And as soon as they left, guess what? The meeting was not adjourned. So then U.S. says, okay, well, the representative of Soviet Union is not here, but the meeting is not adjourned and the issue is still in front of us. Let's go for the next thing to vote. Here we go. So they are voting on is North Korea is an aggressor or not. Guess what? This is during the hottest part of the Cold War. And then, in 1950s, obviously, is that right? So what happened was there was nobody to oppose it or give a veto, The 5 permanent members, they can actually veto the, resolution. There was nobody to veto it. So what? It passed. Surprisingly, is that right? Because there was no Soviet Union to veto it. So after that, Soviet Union learned that even if I'm going to be the only person in the meeting who's going to disagree, I would never, ever leave the room. Because as soon as I leave, if everybody else agrees with that other point of view, they're going to pass another resolution without my vote. Is going to go through. That's how the Korean War became defined as a collective security issue, and then they sent mostly U.S. plus a number of other countries. They sent soldiers to become so-called peacekeepers, which actually they end up protecting the South against North. I wanted you to know. The second story happened when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and that was as you know, it was that, and in the late summer of 1990, and by that time, Soviet Union was going also to a process and things like that, and changes and whatever. And the Cold War was almost ending by that time. And when the whole nation came to the attention of the Security Council that, hey, is Saddam Hussein actually an aggressor or not? Even though by that time, Soviet Union / Russia had a very, close relationship with Saddam Hussein. They said, well, yeah, I guess this is it, So they voted with everybody else. And by that time, by the way, China was also what? Red China, not just island of Taiwan, was an official member of the Security Council, and they actually voted that too. And then again, this case passed on, and then they decided to, So those are the only 2 times that the notion of collective security have officially passed the Security Council. And then the rest we have talked about some of it. So other than those 2 cases, the other times during the Cold War, it was not very successful. All right, now let's talk a little bit about slide number 5. It says origin of peacekeeping, and it goes to the definition of that. And for definition, they use for Tuna's argument in terms of does peacekeeping work or not. This was a work that Fortuna did in 2008. Defines the concept right there. I'm not going to define it because I want you to go and use the PowerPoint. I put all of those things in the PowerPoint. I really hope, as I mentioned before, that when you're looking at my, watching my video lectures, you're really using the PowerPoint, because notice that the PowerPoint really includes a lot of information that you can see, some of it in the quizzes, some of it in short answers, some of it in in the essay, so it's valuable. I know your time is valuable and you prefer, to use it doing other things, but really, please watch these videos. Okay. The next notion is the peacekeeping has been originated basically as an ad hoc, practical, solution to some of the problems associated with the war, especially when it's associated with the notion of collective security. To be honest with you, actually peacekeeping is not even mentioned in the UN Charter, but it has been developed as a response to the conflict that has been growing, and it required, some kind of attention here and there. So as you can see. In slide number 6, I talked about the origins of the peacekeeping, is that right? And then here we talk about the 3 key principles of peacekeeping. I mean, you can't just say, okay, the war started right there, let's send peacekeeping. United Nations is not a world government to order people to do stuff, okay? Remember, it's an organization. It requires membership, okay? So there are rules associated with peacekeeping. The 3 key principles in that regard are, number 1, for peacekeeping, sending peacekeeping, consent of both parties, the 2 parties involved in the war. Impartiality is very important. You can't send, for example, okay, we send some peacekeeping that is supporting one side and not the other side. But that is not fair. The peacekeepers should be people coming from countries that they have no interest in either one. Is that right? Or at least they have equal relationship. And last but not least, non-use of force except in self-defense. Is that right? So the peacekeepers, they can go over there and say, oh, okay, wait a minute. Those guys, they don't look nice. Let's shoot them first and then ask questions second. You can't do that. Is that right? And, they have to, sometimes they have also a mandate. What should we do? Should we just separate them? Should we bring them together to negotiate or whatever? Okay. Slide number 7 is talking about peacekeeping generation. And I think that's kind of interesting. See, these questions like that or slides like that could make a very good short answer. Is that right? I can say, for example, mention 3 out of the 4 major generation of peacekeepers. So here we go. First generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation. It's talking about first generation start with small scale mission with very modest ambition. Second generation talks about more extensive mandates. Third generation talks about peace enforcement, and fourth generation refers to what? Peace building. Okay, slide number 8 talks about Cold War and peacekeeping. And of course, it covers first the period of 1948 to 88. And it's talking about like 15 different missions. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, 15 different missions. And most of it was in, Middle East and Africa. And then they're also, in terms of continuation of that, they refer to relatively small, with limited, ambition, groups that they were acting basically like a buffer. Is that right? So acting like a buffer between combating, forces. Then, exception, of course, was in 1960s, the mission to Congo. Oh my gosh, that was a major issue because at the height of it, they had 20,000 troops. Okay, 20,000 peacekeepers over there. And this was not an easy thing to handle. The slide number 9 is talking about the Cold War again and peacekeeping. This is the second slide associated with that topic. It focuses on the notion of Cold War peacekeeping was limited in mandates and everything. And of course, it talks about, this has been used especially in conflict zone like in the Arab, Israeli, or better to say Israeli-Palestinian one. That's one. The other one, India-Pakistan one. But both missions, yes, they send peacekeepers, but let's face it, neither one of those issues has been resolved. And as you can see in terms of what happened in October 2023 with, October 7, 2023 with Hamas, making a surprise attack against, Israel, the all-powerful Israel, it shows that issue has not been solved. Now, in my Middle East politics course, I've already talked about this one, and this course, we just basically gently touch about it, that's so-called Arab-Israeli. If you're interested, you can always take that course, or when I teach international politics of the Middle East, is that right? That particular conflict has really different dimension, and it's not as sad as we think, because it's not totally all Arab states against Israel, is that right? It's basically the Arab states which are around Israel, and 2 out of those 4 Arab states, remember, Egypt is one side, Jordan is another side, Syria is another side, and last but not least, in the north is Lebanon. Is that right? 2 of them, they already have peace treaty with Israel. Okay, Egypt and Jordan, they have a peace treaty. It's Syria and Lebanon that they don't have peace treaty. But the issue that has been very frankly, has been swept under the carpet, even after 1993 Oslo agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, has been the issue of Palestinians themselves. We are not talking about the states over there. So one aspect of that conflict was state to state. And you remember in chapter 31, when we finished the, book, it talks about that notion, those type of notions, all right? The other aspect of it has been a relationship between a state, Israel, and a non-state actor, Palestinians. Palestinians, they have so-called declared themselves independence, but it takes 5 different, characteristics for a state to be a state. And the issue has been kind of, swept under the carpet, and technically they don't have their independence because the Israeli soldiers, at least even in the West Bank, which is the most advanced part of it, are basically running the show. And they just left, as you know, they left Gaza many years ago. They said, you know what, you take care of yourself. And here we go. What happened? Hell broke loose. So, we need to think about these issues in terms of the causes. Yes, it's very important to make sure that those, more than 1,400 people who got slaughtered in Israel, they feel some kind of peace. Then we have, as of now, as of this date, at least there have been about 230 to 240, depending on different numbers you're going by, hostages. Is that right? And at the same time, as you know, that as Israelis, they've moved to Gaza, there have been a number of bombardments, there have been Palestinian dying. As of, I think, this morning when I was driving from Titusville, it was talking about in the neighborhood of 10,000, So 10,000, 1,400 or 1,500 or something on the Israeli side, because they're still finding sometimes. Some of those numbers are sometimes increasing, unfortunately. I just feel sad. As a pacifist, I feel sad any innocent person dying, in any issue. And of course, in political science, what do we teach you? We try to teach you techniques of peace, basically peacekeeping, peace, enforcement, and diplomacy and negotiation. All right, enough about that part. Let's get back to this, which is basically talking about those issues are not resolved. That's how we got to talk a little bit more about that issue. And of course, there are some conflicts that have been basically, off limits. Like, for example, when U.S. was in Vietnam, they didn't want any peacekeepers. They said, okay, we are there to get rid of communists, to protect our ally, South Vietnam, and you know what happened. Is that right? So there have been a lot of, so then we can say in 1970s and 80s, actually some of these peacekeeping activity declined because they thought, okay, we're not getting anywhere. Now, slide number 10 talks about, again, this is like the third slide in relationship to the notion of post-Cold War and peacekeeping. It talks about, the impact that Cold War had and the post-Cold War had, because during the Cold War, as you know, there was not much of a peacekeeping. Now, what about in the post-Cold War? From 1989 to 1994, there were like 20 new missions. Where were these 2 missions? These missions were in former Yugoslavia, in Cambodia, and in El Salvador. So I want you to know some of these things, okay? So if somebody talks about them, you have some ideas, as somebody who took INR 2002. Okay, so the nature of peacekeeping and has changed. That's another important one. Then we go to slide number 11. And in that one, they're talking about expanded role. Include expanded role of what? Peacekeepers. So here we go. I read some of these things for you because the book, I thought, has done a pretty good job. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. Some of these, expanded roles include monitoring election, protecting civilian, providing and protecting humanitarian aid, demilitarizing the combatants, reconstructing state institution, and last but certainly not least, what? Peace enforcement activities. Okay. Beyond that one, the slide number 12, you see that it talks about, peacekeeping in the 1990s. They encountered a number of failures. What were some of the failures? 3 cases that is very important to mention are these. Number 1 was Bosnia, because it's, Srebrenica or something, there was a major massacre despite the fact that there were peacekeepers there. How could that happen? In Somalia, that's another case. In Rwanda, my goodness gracious, in Rwanda, that they made even movies out of this story, sadness of people, the fight between Hutus and, Tutsis and everything. There were 800,000 people killed. Okay, this is just a little bit less than, a million, million people. That's a very significant number, no matter how you count it. So that was important to know. Now, some of the other things that you need to consider is that UN peacekeeping has had, has not been abandoned despite some of these people, thank goodness, because you don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. Okay, we are not suggesting the peacekeeping has been the most successful, event ever. No, it hasn't. But, you need to consider that what are some of the issues that has caused problem for them. There are a few alternative actors, to perform UN, roles, and these have been some of the challenges that they have had. Reform has been very important, in that regard for reforming how you do this one. Could you maybe use sometimes technology, drones, etc. Working with others is very important in form of what they call hybrid, peace, keeping. This is important. Now, there are also some major problems associated with that. 3 of them that I like to mention here in slide number 14, I mentioned it, is one is budget. Guess what? Peacekeeping activity takes money, okay? It's not for free. It takes money. That's one problem. The other problem was superpower rivalry. Right after Cold War ended, for a few years, there was not much of a really hassle between, the new Russian Federation and US. And China was not so active. So it was a little bit easier. But right after that, as soon as Russian Federation became strong and China became strong, again, we have seen superpower rivalry. And when there is superpower rivalry, guess what? It makes the job of the UN and peacekeepers much harder because sometimes they don't want it. They say, okay, let them fight it out or whatever. Last but not least, unfortunately, the third factor is scandals. Unfortunately, there are some scandals, associated with allegation of, abuse of local people, sex trafficking, number of other things associated with that, which is sad. Is that right? Last but not least, in that regard, when we focus on the slides, slide number 15 is focusing on peace building. Okay, so here we are talking about not just preventing the combatant to fight, but also helping institution to actually develop and resolve this issue in a diplomatic way. Is that right? So peace building has become very, very important. This whole notion is associated with John, Galtung, who championed this whole notion in 1970s and came to the UN, the topic came to the UN in 1990s. So a major reason for the UN adoption of this whole notion is because, if an issue is not resolved, guess what? It keeps coming back. You see what I mean? It's just like the so-called Arab-Israeli one. Is that right? To be honest with you right now, the relationship between Israel and its Arab state is much more manageable. You have seen like a couple of years ago, they had the Abraham, treaty that Israel is normalizing its relationship with places like, UAE, Bahrain, things like that. And they were just before this October 7 attack, they were actually negotiating with Saudi Arabia. That's a very major thing. I don't want you, I know that some of my students are disappointed with all those wars and everything, especially when you focus on a conflict like the so-called Arab-Israeli one. But honest to God, situation is not as bad as it used to be. Before, it used to be a lot worse than this, okay? So hopefully your generation would be more successful than our generation in terms of handling these issues. I hope many of you become diplomats, ambassadors, negotiators, and come up with much better solution to bring peace. So nobody, suffers. I don't like to see suffering. How do you think I became, a professor of international relations focusing on diplomacy and negotiation? Because I don't like that type of things happening. Anyway, so there have been issues in terms of peace building. So as we do peace building, hopefully these issues do not come up. Now you might ask, what are some of these activities of peace building? Well, in slide number 16, I put it for you. All right, what are some of the examples? Disarmament and demobilization, providing basic services, constitutional reform, promoting human rights, economic revitalization, inclusive dialogues and reconciliation, strengthening the role of law, and transitional justice, and so factors like that. In number 17 slide, I basically talk about the UN 3 major bodies that they oversee this type of peace building type of activities. I mentioned just the institutions because guess what? They have done the book has done a nice job of describing this one. One is the Peace Building Commission, which is also known for short as PBC. The other one is a Peace Building Fund, which is short, the short version of it or acronym for that is PBF. And last but certainly not least is Peace Building Support Office, which uses the acronym PBSO. Okay, so please take a look at those things. I put it over there for you to summarize the material of the text, make it more digestible for you. And last but not least, slide number 18. Again, focusing on the peace building. We can say peace building also faces, as we mentioned, some challenges and criticism. Nothing is perfect. Is that right? Okay. So too often, sometimes the peace building is associated with liberal model of international relation, focusing on democracy and individual rights and everything. And they say that by focusing on that one, you're ignoring local culture and values. That's one criticism. The second thing is they say it's usually a top-down approach. Is that right? As opposed to focusing on the bottom, the marginal areas. Is that right? Focusing on the grassroots. So that's another one. They say that, for example, following this type of priorities by focusing on just on the top, the priorities of elite and urban centers, they get attention, and they're marginalizing local people, which is what I told you. And last but not least, major question has been, does it really work? Well, to be honest with you, nothing is perfect. Sometimes it has worked, sometimes it hasn't. The problem is when something doesn't happen all the time, people, they think it's a failure all the time. That's not true, okay? Again, let's don't throw the baby with the bathwater, okay? So let's think about the successes. Let's see what went wrong, that there were failures, and let's deal with those failures to make those in future to be future successes. Okay, I hope you, like this chapter and the topic of it, which sounds, focusing on a positive aspect of international relation. If you have any question, as usual, what do? You contact me, okay? Thank you.